Good morning, everybody. Coming to you from Bible Explorations. Today we're going over what's the new chapter 13 in the book, the Covenant Code, that I'm just currently finishing up. First of all, there's we began chapter 12 with a test of genuine gold versus pyrite or fool's gold. And we showed the two nuggets, and we said, based on appearance alone, which of these is the genuine gold and which nugget is the fake gold, the deception. And our little test revealed that by a small percentage on outside appearance alone, that most people chose the pyrite. And here we begin chapter 13 with, and the basis of that was to say all that glitters is not gold. In other words, sometimes things appear to be genuine or authentic or valuable, that when tested either through our own experience or mostly through our own experience, actually, they turn out to be worthless. They turn out to be of no value at all to us. So here there's two open books, and the one on the left is the Darwin's theory of evolution, and on the right is the biblical testimony. And on the left is some of the evidence that he used to create the opposition to the biblical testimony. And to the right, of course, is the testimony that evidences its own truth. And also in Revelation, those that reveals those that are opposed to the truth and the deceptions that they employ. So based entirely on the appearance alone, and of course, anyway, based on appearance alone, which of these two testimonies is full of evidence, actual evidence of its truth? And which of these two testimonies, two open books, do you have to believe on faith alone? It has zero evidence of its own testimony, its own truth. So the one on the left, Darwin's theory of evolution, or the biblical testimony. And we further in the last chapter talked about the state of Christian belief in America today, and saw that it had declined to 20% that believe that the Bible was the Word of God, and much worse than that, 86% of even the Christian population, the pastors, the elders, the people that sit in the pews, they had adopted a synchronistic or a blend of beliefs. So a little bit of this, a little bit of that. And this resulted in every major Christian church and Catholic church all adhering to theistic evolution, which is that that God used evolution to create everything. And so evolution is where the evidence is, because that's where what God guided. That was his only role, is guiding evolution to eventually create man. So of course this is directly opposed to the biblical testimony. Excuse me. But by outside appearances, that's what the world, even Christian America, believes today. So as we did with gold and the pyrite, the only way we can actually get to the truth is to test the actual nuggets for the evidence of the truth. So that's what really this first part is about. Let's skip ahead a little bit here. So the evidence of the truthfulness of the opposing testimonies. Well, evolutionists claim the evidence of their theory dates back billions of years. The first publication of the same theory was November 24th, 1859 by Charles Darwin. The first 5 books of the biblical testimony was published on papyrus scrolls preserved by the nation of Israel in 1406 BC. The first evidence of the publication of the entire Old Testament and the complete translation from Hebrew to Greek was published in Alexandria, Egypt in the 2nd century BC. The complete biblical testimony, Old and New Testament, is by far the best evidenced and preserved written works among all the written works of antiquity. In modern terms, it is by far the leading published written works and printed in every known language in all of human history. Through the human ability of observation, we were able to look backward in time and observe the available evidence of the things we were unable to observe by sight. So like modern forensics is founded upon the science of observing the evidence, like fingerprints, DNA, eyewitness reports, etc., to piece together the evidence of events in the past that the forensic experts did not personally witness. So we'll begin our observations by going back as far that is observable today of the origins of the modern opposing testimonies. So when was the first time that these opposing testimonies are documented in a written form? The earliest documented testimony of these opposing beliefs is found in the 3rd chapter of the 1st book of the Bible, which is the chapter of Genesis, that the biblical testimony credits to being the eyewitness testimony of Moses. 2 statements are key and most relevant to our observation of the origin of the 2 opposing testimonies that remain with us today. So these 2 key statements is Genesis 3:1. Now the serpent was more cunning than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. And he said to the woman, has God indeed said, you shall not eat of every tree of the garden? The second key observation about these opposing testimony is Genesis 3:14, 15. So the Lord God said to the serpent, this is in the judgment afterwards, because you have done this, I will put my enmity between you, which is deceiving mankind. I will put my enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. So as we define these separate things that we just observed, cunning means having or showing skill in achieving one's ends by deceit or evasion. That's what cunning is. Deceit is defined as the action or practice of deceiving by concealing or misrepresenting the truth. And evasion is the act of avoiding something or creating a way around it. They're adherent evasion of almost all questions. So it's sidestepping, dodging, bypassing, avoiding, ducking. So you have deceit and you have evasion. There's 2 different tactics there. One is to misrepresent or conceal the truth. The other way is to figure out ways to avoid questions about it. According to the biblical testimony, the source of the first testimony to directly oppose the word of God that was proposed to deceive the entire human population at that time, which was Adam and Eve, was the one referred to as the serpent. The same biblical testimony describes the skill possessed by this deceiver and the actions, the deceit, the evasion, employed to achieve his goal. Now we fast forward to the sophists of 6th century BC and modern sophism. According to Wikipedia, Thales of Miletus, was an ancient Greek pre-Socratic philosopher from Miletus of Ionia, Asia. Now that area is in modern-day Turkey, but at that time it was called Asian Minor, and that's the same area that the letters to the in the Book of Revelation were sent out to. So it's kind of a very key area. It was also the area where most of the philosophers and the schools of philosophy, Greek, originated, and because they were a territory of Greece, and they, so there's a lot of opposing testimony going on there as well. And Thales was one of the 7 sages, founding figures of ancient Greece, beginning in the 18th century. So this is after they had dug up and the field of archaeology had sprung to life in the Age of Enlightenment. They come across these Greek writings and references to these philosophers. So beginning in the 18th century, historically, many came to regard him, this is Thales, as the first Greek philosopher to break from the prior tradition of use of mythology or the mythological gods to explain the world, and instead using natural philosophy. He was titled the father of science and the first to engage in mathematics, science, and deductive reasoning. So this is what they all jumped upon and started to claim in the 18th century. The same 18th century proponents credited Thales as being the first astronomer to reportedly predict a solar eclipse, as well as the timing of solstices and equinoxes. However, through the progress in the then infant science of archaeology, so what happened after that time, and archaeology is the study of ancient and recent human past through material remains, so things that they actually observed. It has been since unearthed that the sages of ancient Egypt, Babylon, and the region of the Near East had been observing and predicting solar eclipses and other major solar and lunar events and developing mathematics for at least 1,500 years before Thales. So Athens, Greece was in the west, but all through the east, in Babylon, Egypt, etc., the wise men that are referred to in the Bible had been observing and predicting all of these celestial events and had been developing mathematics for 1,500 years before Thales. The difference is that these observations were kept secret or occult. Sorry, we got interrupted there. Through this occult knowledge, so secret or occult, to all but the initiates. So these wise men, this small group of initiates, they're usually their sons or their very close relatives that they would share the actual secrets to, so it could pass along from generation to generation. But those were very tightly held secrets. So they passed them on from generation as job security of the wise men in relation to the rulers, because remember, the rulers had all the power, but having this knowledge that they didn't share, they would share observations, but they wouldn't share how they came to them. Made them look like they were prophetic, and it yielded great power for the wise men in advance of a solar event, for example. Through this occult knowledge, they were able to foretell an event ahead of its occurrence and use the fulfillment of that event to either support or oppose the ruler by positioning it as a sign from the gods. In other words, if the ruler had favored them and treated them well, they would use these signs as that the ruler was favored by the god. If the ruler was trying to depose them or wasn't treating them well, they would use it as signs that the gods were against the king. So the king was in favor or disfavor of the gods, then the sun will be, so they make a statement in advance. If the king is in favor or disfavor of the gods, then the sun will be darkened 3 days from today. And then it would occur, and everyone would believe that the signs were from the gods, and that would determine the fate of the ruler. Thales used the same occult knowledge to emerge in Athens with similar predictions without referring to the gods. So he used the same observations, but this time he didn't credit it to the gods, he took credit for himself. The historian Josephus specifically mentioned the travels to Babylon by Thales. More recent historians have referenced the evidence of the travels of Thales to Egypt and to Babylon. The most compelling evidence that Thales did not originate the geometry and mathematics that he claimed to be of his own device is the sexagesimal number system, or the base 60 number system. And that is a numerical system with 60 as its base. It originated with the ancient Sumerians in the 3rd millennium BC. It was passed down to the ancient Babylonians and is still used in modified form for measuring time, angles, and geographic coordinates. The evidence implies Thales was first to introduce the West to this occult knowledge, but not the original source. I mean, obviously, he used the same system that had been in practice for over 1,500 years. In transferring this wisdom to themselves rather than the revelation of the gods, the ancient Greek philosophers gained tremendous influence, authority, and financial gains in Athens. Philosophy is a combination of two Greek terms, philium, which is lover, and sophia, which is wisdom, lover of wisdom. So when they refer to themselves as philosophers, they refer to themselves as lovers of wisdom. So a philosopher was related to any field where intelligence was observed or expressed. This was considered to be the first philosopher of science. The term science originally came from the term scientia, which meant knowledge or knowledgeable expertise. There arose among them a sect of philosophers that referred to themselves as the sophists. The term sophist is from the Greek sophistias, which literally means wise men. So the literal translation of this claim means that among all of the lovers of wisdom, or the philosophers, they claim to be the wisest. The first distinction between them and the traditional philosophers was that the traditional philosophers limited the source of their wisdom to their own initiatives. So they did like they did in the East, where only a certain amount of people were trusted with the source of this wisdom. They would declare the outcome and use that to their advantage, but they wouldn't declare the source. They would keep that secret among their initiatives. The sophists became the first paid educators and sold the secrets of their craft to the elite of Athens at a handsome price. So that distinguished them from the other philosophers that they, they sold their secrets. But the most distinguishing, or the thing that most distinguishes the ancient sophists from the traditional philosophers at that time was their boast of having no objective in the discovery of the search for the truth, but instead being concerned only with the creation of the appearance of the truth. They believed there was no such thing as absolute truth. Instead, truth was only the perception of one's belief. Therefore, being able to persuade the audience into believing the appearance of the truth was of greater value because this persuasion resulted in achieving one's objective. It could win a political debate, resulting in the gain of power. It could win a court case or any other desired objective. It was based equally on the teaching of the Eastern mystics. However, it was not concerned with the observable science that was used to deceive the people. Instead, it was based on craft and the skill set developed over thousands of years of how to employ the secret knowledge to deceive the people. The Eastern mystics had developed a complete array of techniques that were the most persuasive literary devices that could be employed to deceive the audience. The sophists gave a name to this craft. They called it rhetoric. Through their paid teachings, they boasted those that learned the craft would be able to win either side of the same argument. So they also traveled east. They also were wealthy, educated people that traveled east, but they weren't interested in the science. They were interested in the method and how these things were able to deceive people for so long. They claimed and demonstrated that this craft could even make the weaker position of any argument appear to be the stronger position, that they could enter any debate without any prior knowledge of the subject matter and with no supporting evidence and emerge victorious through the power of persuasion alone. It included numerous tactics and actions that were purposed to be used together so that if the first was not sufficient, then the next would be employed until by the end of the culmination of combined tactics, they persuaded their audience into believing that the preponderance of the evidence favored the sophist, despite the fact that no actual evidence was employed at all. In summary, it is a cunning skill set that achieves one's objectives through deceit and evasion, the origins of which we'd observed previously in the biblical testimony. So it's cunning and having or showing a skill in achieving one's ends by deceit or evasion. The deceit is the action or practice of deceiving by concealing or misrepresenting the truth. And the evasion is the action of avoiding something or creating a way around it. So those are the exact same skill set demonstrated by Satan or the serpent in the garden. And the sophists had gave a name to these same skill sets. They observed what these wise men had been doing for thousands of years to deceive the people, and they picked up on that and just focused on that craft. The creation of the appearance of truth versus any genuine search for it was despised by their contemporary traditional philosophers such as Plato. Today, the term sophism is used to describe a fallacious argument that is crafted with the purpose to deceive the listener. So when we commonly hear the term rhetoric being employed today in such things as political debates, we believe it is a harmless and obvious tactic that has no ability to influence or deceive us. But this belief completely underestimates the power of sophism and the effective totality of its tactics that are employed to deceive and persuade us. This underestimated, this underestimation deadens our awareness and makes us even more susceptible to its ability to persuade our beliefs. The biblical testimony states, when the woman saw that their tree was good for food and pleasing to the eyes, and that it was desirable for obtaining wisdom, she took the fruit and ate it. She also gave some to her husband, who was with her, and ate it. It was not the first tactic of Satan that succeeded in persuading her to risk her life for a taste of the forbidden fruit. It was a culmination of several tactics that eventually persuaded her that the fruit was desirable for obtaining wisdom. No one wants to be thought of as being ignorant or unable to receive wisdom, but our generation is equally gullible to adapting the secondary beliefs of the apparent wise ones as our own beliefs in our rapid access internet world without testing the evidence of the truthfulness for ourselves. When the Pharisees claimed to be of the seed of Abraham, which was the promised seed, Jesus returned one of his most condemning accusations against them. They were genetically the seed, they were genetically of Abraham's seed, but spiritually they held the beliefs of Satan in their opposition to the word of God. You are of your father the devil, and your will is to do your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks out of his own character, for he is a liar and the father of lies. The origin of the species and the art of rhetoric employed as sophism. Few scholars familiar with both science and the art of rhetoric attempt to deny that Darwin's book on the origin of species is a masterpiece in rhetoric. In fact, many boast of this fact as being what distinguishes Darwin from others of similar beliefs and be able to make such a persuasive and influential argument. For example, an article published in American Science, and there's the references, who it was, when it was published, and the quotation. Everybody has a copy, but like Stephen Hawking's A Brief History of Time, the work is rarely read from cover to cover. So he's talking about scientists having a copy of the book, but hardly ever reading it. Those who in the past bicentennial year of Darwin's birth and sequential year of the publication of The Origin have taken the time to study the book carefully may have noticed an oddity in its structure. It is quite unlike most scientific books of its time or of ours in the development of its subject. As Darwin explained both in his final chapter and his later autobiography, the 501 pages of The Origin were composed as one long argument using a bunch of different tactics. And like everything Darwin did, it was carefully calculated. Philosophers and logicians have therefore long been interested in Darwin's rhetorical method. So they don't deny that the whole book is a rhetorical masterpiece. While these initiated modern professors of wisdom can admire Darwin's usage of rhetoric and his persuasive ability to influence others to adopt his secondary beliefs as their own, they do not touch on how the same craft of rhetoric can be used to deceive, because all of those, beginning with Darwin, truly do believe in natural evolution independent of a special divine creation. However, because this belief directly opposes the Word of God, they can find no genuine evidence that supports their beliefs. So they look the other way when rhetoric is employed as the only evidence in a false belief that the authentic evidence they're seeking will soon come. For example, Darwin had to address in his book that the actual evidence on his subject matter testified against his theory. Darwin described the complete absence of transitional fossils. So fossils are life forms that are in transition from the original species to the evolved species. So the lack of that in the geological fossil record as the gravest objection which can be urged against my theory. Shortly after publishing the book, Darwin sent it to the most renowned scientist of the time, Harvard geologist and paleontologist Louis Agassiz. After receiving it, he informed Darwin that the fossil record did not support Darwin's theory, so this chapter was already published, and that all life began, or his theory that all life began from a common ancestor and then proceeded through the process of natural selection, generating gradually more complex life forms. Agassiz pointed out that instead, the fossil record was marked by the sudden appearance and disappearance of unrelated and different species. Moreover, many of the most complex life forms appear very early in the history of evidence, so very early in the fossil record. In a written response, Darwin acknowledged that if whole groups of species were to have indeed apparently appeared suddenly, his theory would be proved false. Darwin wrote, if numerous species belonging to the same genera or families have really started into life all at once, the fact would be fatal to the theory of descent with slow modification through natural selection, which of course is just what has been observed the past 150 years. The theory survives due to the sophist rhetorical response of the advocates of the theory in demonstrating equal cunning to achieve their objective through deceit and evasion. Yet the fossil record is not Darwin's greatest challenge. It is the most obvious one that he himself chose. So the sophist rhetorical straw man fallacious argument. So there's different tactics and used to deceive. One of them is called the straw man theory. The straw man fallacy, sometimes written as straw man, is a rhetorical fallacy of refuting an argument different from the one actually under discussion, while not recognizing or acknowledging the distinction. One who engages in this is said to be attacking a straw man. So they know the opponent's argument or position, but they change it and they set it up as something that they could easily defeat, and then they refuse to acknowledge that or answer the change. Well, that's not my position. They just ignore it. My opponent says this. My opponent believes this. So it's a straw man. The typical straw man agreement creates the illusion of having refuted or defeated an opponent's proposition through the covert replacement of it with a different proposition. So that's called standing up the straw man. And the subsequent refutation or refuting the false argument is called knocking down the straw man instead of the opponent's actual position. In Darwin's case, it is his usage of the term species. Up until the late 17th century, animals and plants were commonly referred to as the kind of plant or animal they were. English naturalist John Ray was the first person to produce a biological definition of a species in his 1686 History of Plants. He said in his definition, no sure criterion for determining species has occurred to me than the distinguishing features that perpetuate themselves in propagation from the seed. Thus, no matter what varieties occur in the individual or the species, if they spring from the seed of one and the same plant, they are variations and not such to distinguish a species. Animals likewise that differ specifically preserve their distinct species permanently. One species never springs from the seed of another or vice versa. So he's saying, although there's great variations within the seed or a type of animal or plant, that variation, it always remains that kind or that species of plant. It never creates a new seed for a different kind of animal or plant. This definition did not oppose the word of God. It agreed with it. The seed of any living organism would produce like living organisms after their own kind. We simply replaced the biblical and common use term kind with the biological term species and pointed out, although great variation occurred within the species, they never resulted in a new species or kind or give rise to the seed of a new species or kind. The creation testimony is here. And God said that the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after its kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth, and it was so. And the earth brought forth grass and herb yielding seed after its kind, and the tree yielding fruit, whose seed was in itself after his kind. And God saw that it was good. John Ray produced, and we're talking just there about the plants, about the animals later on. John Ray produced a 3-volume work titled Historia Plantarum, classifying 18,000 plant species or kinds. He defined a species, or his definition of a species agreed with the biblical testimony based upon considerable observation. He saw that what farmers and breeders observed since antiquity: if you plant a potato, expect a potato. If you breed cattle, expect a cow. Half a century later, all that changed. Carlos Linnaeus was referred to by Darwin as his God. He was most recently named by Wikipedia as the most influential man in all of human history. What were the great achievements of Linnaeus that earned him such unparalleled distinction? He was a Swedish biologist and physician who formalized the new binomial nomenclature, the modern system of naming organisms. He is known as the father of modern taxonomy. His new system replaced the previous definition of a species by John Ray with 2 very influential and lasting notations. One was that he was the first naturalist to include man within the animal kingdom. In 1735, the class into which he inserted him had a certain name, and then he later changed these names to mammals and primates later in his career. He also changed the definition of a species as being what Ray had testified as being simply variations of the same kind of plant or animal. These observable variations within the genetic seed of every living organism were reduced to being defined as a new species of plant or animal. So he took what Ray has called a variation, and instead of calling them a variation of the same kind, he said each one of these is a new species. This is the straw man that allowed Darwin to subsequently demonstrate the rise of the new species. In so doing, it made it appear that Ray and the Bible had been defeated and testifying that plants and animals do not give rise to new life or new life forms of a different seed. The demonstration of new species appeared to disprove this. In other words, nothing had changed except for the terminology of classifying man as an animal and then classifying the variations of any seed of a man or animal or plant, these variations that exist, as actually new species. So that allowed Darwin to use that type of evidence to prove there was new species formed, and that made it appear like the biblical testimony, and that of John Ray was defeated. So what is the species problem? The species problem is a set of questions that arises when biologists attempt to define what a species is. This is talking about today. Such a definition is called a species concept. Today, there are at least 26 recognized species concepts. A species concept that works well for sexually producing organisms, such as birds, is useless for species that produce asexually, such as bacteria. While the non-initiatives never hear about this, it is a major conundrum in the evolutionary theory community. According to the article in ScienceDirect.com, the species problem is a long-lasting failure, of biologists to agree on how we should identify species and how we should define the word species. The innumerable attacks on the problem, this is amongst their own community, have turned the oft-repeated question, what are species, into a philosophical conundrum. The Linnaeus definition of a species has led to mass confusion in how to even define a species today. Let's explore this a little further ourselves. So that's why he was considered the most influential man of all time, because his new theory, his new nomenclature has resulted in mass confusion even amongst biologists. So, but based on the modern nomenclature, how many species of animals do you observe in these variant shapes and colors? So you notice very small to very large, different shapes, different colors, different length of hair, different thickness of hair, curly, wavy, straight. So out of all these different characteristics, or these different traits, how many species has this resulted in? And the answer is that all domestic dogs, which these are classified as a single species. This is by today's standard of the family Carnivora, and a subspecies, and they're considered a subspecies of the gray wolf, and they're a species related to foxes and jackals, which are different species. The dog is one of the most ubiquitous and most popular domestic animals in the world. The cat is the other. All horse breeds, from lean thoroughbred racehorses to stocky plow horses to tidy ponies, belong to a single species. So dogs, cats, horses, they're all considered today to be one species. The domestic cat, Felis catus, is also a single species defined as a small carnivorous animal. All variations of domestic dogs, cats, horses are classified as each being a single species, so they're all just variations. In each of these, we observe the tremendous variety of the gene pool that resides in their seed, and that is expressed when they interbreed. Tall, short, long hair, short hair, skin pigmentation, body types, and other traits. So then we just take a look at the horse breeds. We see, again, huge variation in size, color, pigmentation, etc. From the smallest Alabella, which is the little guy down here, to the largest Shire, which is this big boy over here, and every size and color variation in between, all belong to a single species according to current classifications. The same is true of cats and every other kind of domesticated animal. The modern classification of domestic species of animals agrees with the biblical testimony and raised the original biological definition of the term species. They are all one kind or species of animal with obvious great variation in their seed. All can interbreed, even the seeds among those with physical mating barriers, such as between the large Shire and the smaller Falabella. So between this little guy and this big guy here, there's obviously a physical barrier to interbreeding. But if combined and artificially inseminated, their blended seeds can result in a successful pregnancy and fertile offspring. So obviously you would impregnate the larger, the female, but if you do that, they would result in a successful pregnancy and a fertile offspring that carry the genes 50-50 of the two different breeds. But now observe what happens when theorists classify wild species, so non-domestic species. How many species of birds are pictured below? And these are both the exact same size and the exact same weight. They don't show the variation we saw of size and weight, body type. So how many species are pictured here of these birds? According to modern classifications, they are two distinct species, the Baltimore and Bullock oriole, not variations of the same as is applied to domestic animals. Furthermore, this specific oriole classification has changed and reversed in the recent past based entirely upon rhetorical devices, not any evidence. Genetic and other evidence had demonstrated that they were virtually identical. So in other words, they tested the entire genome between them. And the only differences they found between these two was those related to color pigmentation, for black, orange, etc. So, and location. So the only difference, they were like 0.03% apart. The only difference between the two was one had more black pigmentation in its gene. It was located more, let's just go back to the picture, for example. So you look at the head of this one is completely black. This one has a little bit of a mask here in orange. The wings here have more white pigmentation. These have more black and white. And there's a little bit more orange here, although there's quite a bit of orange there. But these are all genes that tell the DNA tells what color of pigmentation to locate in what areas. But that's it. So because they did that experiment, they decided, it was decided that they should be lumped back together as the same species. But that was then changed back again to being two different species. This genetic and other evidence had demonstrated that they were virtually identical. Subsequently, they were lumped back together as a single species, along with several others, because when they did these types of testing, they took a whole bunch of different types of species that were previously considered to be two species, and they lumped them back into being a single species. But then, that didn't suit the agenda, so they were again separated into separate species as they were previously. So they're subsequently divided back into separate species not long ago and remain today classified as being two species. So this is a map of where it's called the hybridization zone, which is where that means where the two interbreed and where you and the barrier between them. So at the far side of the river is mostly purebred of one breed. At the other side is mostly purebred of the other. And oops, let me just go back here. And as you move closer towards the center, so you have these yellow dots here. So this bird, see all the black, see the orange with the mask here. So that's what the purebred of these species look like. And as you move closer towards the center, you see, this has a little less, a little bit of variation. This in the middle, the very center, it has kind of a combination. It doesn't have a pure mask or pure black head. It has more white on the wing, very subtle, but this is the most extreme example found of the hybrid, of not being fully this or fully that. So the hybrid zone between Bullocks and Baltimore Orioles has been most intensely studied along the Platte River. Yellow dots mark where Orioles were sampled in the 1950s by Cornell professor Charles Sibley, and then again in 2016 by Cornell University Museum of Vertebrates curator Vanya Roer. At the western and eastern edges of the hybrid zone, nearly all birds sampled look like typical Bullock Orioles and Baltimore Orioles, respectively. But in the middle, Orioles display a spectrum of possible plumages, mixing variant combinations of Bullocks and Baltimore colors and patterns. The most extensive mixing was found near the border of the Nebraska and Colorado River, where nearly half of the local breeding Orioles had conspicuous hybrid plumage. So even in the middle, It's only a little less than half that have a mixture that's still in that group, purebred Baltimore and Bullock Orioles. And just credit for the map and illustration from the study. In a nutshell, this Cornell study found that the natural territorial grounds for the Bullock and Baltimore Oriole were located on the far east and far west of the Platte River. In between the two extremes is an area referred to as the hybridization zone, the area where the two species commonly interbreed to produce hybrids. Closest to the center of the zone, the most diverse of the hybrids are found. Look at the center bird of the five to observe this great diversity. So we've already done that. I mean, this is the great diversity they're talking about. Based on these Cornell studies that began in 2016, the Baltimore and Bullock Oriole were separated back into two species. The reason attributed for this was because despite the fact they commonly interbreed, something that they couldn't define what it was keeping them apart at the extremes of the geographic zone and preventing them from all becoming hybrids. So think about this. If the diversity of the plumage we observed was observed in a litter of kittens or puppies, we would consider them to be nearly identical. So when we go back and look at the chart of the diversity that exists among dogs and horses, that the same modern scientific classifies as being the same single species. So you see this great diversity amongst dogs, cats, and horses. We see this little difference between the color of the plumage of the two orioles, and yet they're called two species. Furthermore, the perching birds, which these are all part of a big order called, all belong to the order Passeriformes, from the Latin passer, which means sparrow-shaped or sparrow-formed, and includes more than half of all bird species, sometimes known as perching birds. They have arrangement of their toes, with three pointing forward and one back, which facilitates perching. With over 140 families and some 6,500 identified species, according to the classification, it is the largest order of birds and among the most diverse clades of terrestrial vertebrates, representing 60% of birds that range in size from sparrows to larger ravens. This is the same order of species that Darwin observed. So he has observed what he called finches, but they're actually not even finches, but they're from the same family. The evidence of his theory for evolution of the species. Following is a chart that demonstrates how frequently this large order of birds are known to interbreed. For example, crow and raven hybrids are nicknamed cravens. The darker gray pie slices of those that commonly interbreed among each other to produce hybrids. The light gray slices of those that have not been observed to interbreed. It does not mean that their seeds cannot blend and fertilize, only that the specific species has not been observed to interbreed, just as the Chihuahua and Great Dane seeds are interfertile, but the two dogs breeds are not observed interbreeding due to the physical size restraints. So this is the one that represents these perching birds. You see almost half are known to interbreed, have been observed interbreeding. And this portion of the 6,500 has not been observed interbreeding. But like I said, that's only because the observations, are related to bird watchers and to other people up the field, and they don't observe them commonly interbreeding. Doesn't mean they can't, just that they haven't been observed. This is a lot of observed interbreeding between about 3,000 of the 6,500 species among each other. Even among the balance of the remaining 3,500, how much of the non-observance of their interbreeding is due to physical and other restraints rather than infertility? Using different criteria to establish domestic animals, or to classify domestic animals, than the criteria used to classify wild animals, reduces the science to a subjective art seeking to validate its biased preconceived conclusions. why would you use, if it's a science, why would you use different criteria to classify species? So why are domestic animals classified as one species and those found in nature classified as thousands of species? The reason offered for classifying domestic and wild animals differently is the domestic animals were bred through human intervention, whereas wild animals are through natural selection. This is the evasion part of the deception, to attempt to sidestep the obvious flawed justification. If it were truly a science, then the same classification criteria would apply to all plants and animals. But the inescapable fact is that human selection in breeding domestic animals has only proven without a doubt the variation that can and is achieved in animals over a few generations from the seed of a single species or kind of animal. It accelerates what is observed in nature over a longer period of time through natural selection. Ultimately, the same seed yields a variety of its own kind. So, in other words, if it's a science, then the human intervention where they select the traits they want and keep breeding those with the same traits to get the type of dog they want or the type of horse they want, that type only proves the variation that exists in a single seed, even what they classify as a single seed. So why would you then try and justify classifying wild species differently? It's because there's an agenda. What about modern humans? So modern humans are just as reliant on natural selection as any wild animal because there's no one forcing or selecting traits or whatever for humans. The interbreeding among human is as natural as it is among wild animals with no outside intervention. In fact, this is exactly what Darwin observed. A July 2021 online article from Cambridge University Press titled Of Lice and Men, Charles Darwin, uh, Henry Denny, and the evidence for the human races as variations or species, stated, Charles Darwin never doubted the common ancestry of human races, but he was open-minded about whether the races might nevertheless be so different from each other that they ought to be classified not as varieties of one species, but as distinct species. While obviously flawed and having fallen far outside of modern political correctness, at least it was the correct scientific method to apply the same criteria to classify all living organisms. If the same criteria used to classify wild animals was applied to modern humans, it would result in dozens of separate species based on hair color, skin color, eye shape, body frame, and the like. I mean, look at how little variation there is between those two Orioles. Imagine if they applied that to humans. I mean, your own child would probably be a different species. It has some of your mother, some of the father. Yeah, almost every child would be a new species. The deception originated in redefining and the definition of the variation of each type of animals as a separate species. The evasion continues by using different criteria to classify man and domestic animals as a single species that is used to classify wild animal variations as variant separate species. It is completely arbitrary, subjective, and so barely definable that even biologists cannot agree upon a single definition. It is the species problems, yet is vital to the survival of the theory. Without the criteria applied to wildlife, the theory is void of all observable evidence. So here's what is the modern definition of the theory of evolution? The National Academy of Sciences is an independent, trusted government institution created for the purpose of providing independent, objective advice to the nation on matters related to science and technology and to provide scientific advice to the government whenever called upon by any government department. Their website features evolution resources at the national academies, which include definition of evolutionary terms. So this is how this most trusted uh, independent institution defines these terms. Evolution. Evolution consists of changes to the heritable traits, or those traits that are inherited, of a population of organisms as successive generations replace one another. It is populations of organisms that evolve, not individual organisms. That's the entire definition of the theory of evolution. It's these observed changes in successive generations of inheritable traits. So the plumage, that observance is all that the actual theory of evolution, according to the National Academy of Sciences, states. What do they say about species? Species. In sexually reproducing organisms, species consist of individuals that can interbreed with each other. So this is the definition of species. They're all fertile. They can all interbreed with one another. That's the seed of one type or kind of animal, one species. Is that what we observed in the Baltimore and other Orioles or the other 3,000 of the 6,500? No. These are the definitions, but the definition is limited. The definition doesn't include the word species. It just says organism, and then separately defines species as these in organisms that can interbreed. That's all that can interbreed are considered a single species. What does it call a fact? In science, a fact typically refers to an observation, measurement, or other form of evidence that can be expected to occur the same way under similar circumstances. However, scientists also use the term fact to refer to a scientific explanation that has been tested and confirmed so many times that there's no longer a compelling reason to keep testing it or looking for additional examples. So the most trusted organization offers as clear and easy to understand definitions, but note both what it included and what is not included in the definition of evolutionary terms. All that is included in the definition of evolution is the observance of changes in the inheritable traits from one generation to the next. What is not included is anything to do with the origin of life, how the diversity of all life forms on Earth arose from this original common ancestor, the mechanism that somehow produced the new seeds of every new plant and animal, the fossil record, billions of years, or anything else that is taught in school and repeated through traditional and social media. Only what we observe in the variations that are selected through breeding of domestic animals or naturally selected in wild species, such as Orioles, is used to define evolution. They define a species of animal as being any group of animals that can interbreed with one another. Why are Orioles and thousands of other birds categorized as separate species when they can and do commonly interbreed with another? The definition of a species applies to all living organisms equally. It does not empower the species classifiers to arbitrarily apply different criteria. It is only through first classifying a variation of a kind of animal as a species, and then limiting the formal definition of evolution as observable changes in the traits of successive generations, that the theory has any observable evidence of evolution whatsoever. But even this is not enough to satisfy modern theorists. They then need to define their own limited definitions and arbitrarily apply different criteria to wild animals to make it appear that natural selection is the secret sauce that transforms one kind of animal into an entirely new and separate kind of animal. This deception and evasion combine to allow modern theorists to say without any hesitation that the theory of evolution is the most observable among all scientific theories, because they are only observing what man has observed since the beginning of time, that the seed of two sexually reproducing animals have massive gene pools that are expressed 50-50 from the parents and allow for great variation, but never producing a new seed that gives rise to a different kind of animal. Linnaeus was Darwin's god, and then most influential man in history, because he classified man as an animal and lowered the definition of a species from the kind of animal to a variation of it. To demonstrate that sophism is alive and thriving today in persuading others to adopt secondary beliefs of the theorists as their own beliefs, one only need to observe the modern evolutionary sophists who have stepped out of their lane of science to attack religious faith. Those include leading public spokesmen and authors and presenters that have emerged over the past few decades, such as Richard Dawkins, Bill Nye, Christopher Hitchens, and a handful of other popular authors and presenters. Considering the actual defined evolutionary terms provided by the National Academy of Science that we have observed and what they actually include in those definitions and what they do not include, judge some of the following Richard Dawkins quotations to determine for yourself whether they are genuine or if they are pure sophistry. The fact, remember what it says about the fact, something that's so observable you don't even have to test for anymore. The fact that life evolved out of nearly nothing some 10 billion years after the universe evolved out of literally nothing is a fact. So, as a fact, again, it's so staggering that I would be mad to attempt words to do it justice. Twice Dawkins used the term fact to refer to life evolving out of nearly nothing 10 billion years ago, after the universe evolved out of literally nothing. The National Academy's definition states that scientists use the term fact to refer to a scientific explanation that has been tested and confirmed so many times there's no longer a compelling reason to keep testing it or looking for additional examples. Has there really been so much observable, tested, and confirmed evidence, or any, of the evolution of the universe and all of life? Why is none of this defined in the theory? Alexander of Miletus was the first ancient Greek philosopher who's located in the same area of Asia Minor to hypothesize that life on Earth rose through a natural spontaneous mechanism. He believed spontaneous generation had taken place in the residue of mud and mist on the Earth while the water was being evaporated by the heat of the sun. He believed life must evolve from original creatures with a thorny back that were generated in a warm, soupy slime. He concluded that the diversity of life originated in the sea, and man was hatched by a fish-like creature that ascended to live on Earth. Louis Pasteur proved within 5 years of the publication of Darwin's book that life cannot spontaneously arise out of non-living matter. His thus far irrefutable, highly respected law of biogenesis, or the biogenetic law, states that in nature, life comes only from life, and that of its own kind. It is the first law of biology and has helped govern the progress of biological research. Upon winning an international competition inviting scientists to prove or disprove spontaneous generation, Pasteur publicly declared a death knell to spontaneous generation. He actually said out loud, this is, the end of that idea. Modern beliefs that life arose out of purely natural causes is merely classified as a hypothesis called abiogenesis. So it's lumped together, so you think it's all part of the theory of evolution. But when it's formally written out, it's just a hypothesis that's named abiogenesis. So A means against, so it's opposing biogenesis. It opposes the irrefutable biological law of biogenesis. In spite of Darwin's original focus on the natural origin of the species, abiogenesis, which is the natural emergence of life, is not included in the definition of modern biology or modern theory of evolution. In fact, to believe this hypothesis, one has to deny the highly observable law of biogenesis and accept a never before observed hypothesis. Such is the sophism of Dawkins to label as a fact an unobservable hypothesis that defies the observable foundational biological law. To make the weaker argument, natural spontaneous origin of life, appear to be the stronger, but no worse than the paid educators or the sophists of our generation that fill textbooks and the minds of students with all that they lump together from natural origin and evolution of life, of the universe, to the original origin of life on Earth, and the evolved diversity that we have now observed in their teaching of the theory of evolution. A theory that only has the courage and observable evidence to define as changes in the heritable traits of population of organisms as successive generations replace one another. So that's what's said, but all this other stuff is lumped together by the modern paid educators in their teaching of the theory of evolution. It's not in the definition, it's just lumped together with it and taught in schools. This definition does not even include the word species, only population of organisms. This does not oppose either the original biological definition of John Ray or the biblical testimony. Every sexually reproducing generation will inherit traits or genes equally from the donating parents, resulting in observable changes to the population. Species is defined separately from the definition of the theory as an evolutionary term, defined as individuals that can interbreed. Yet modern theorists separate and create new wild species despite the fact that they do interbreed. So where is this leading to? Rule number 1, defeat the straw man by allowing each opposing testimony to speak for itself. In chapter 12, we began to discuss the premise that all that glitters is not gold. The only way to distinguish between the nuggets to determine which is genuine and which is worthless is first to place them side by side and then to test each for the actual evidence of the truth. The strawman sophism never allows us to do this. It creates a false definition of the opposing testimonies, setting up the strawman, and then appears to defeat this testimony, knocking down the strawman, to make it appear as if it has defeated their opposition. Therefore, in any genuine search for the truth, the first thing we need to do, no matter our personal beliefs, is to allow each opposing testimony to speak for itself and define its own position. Otherwise, our search for the truth is not genuine. Our interest is not in discovering the truth, but instead of merely attempting to justify our beliefs by never allowing the opposing testimony to have its day in court. Contrarily, when we first allow the opposing testimony to speak for himself, then we are in a position to actually test each for the evidence of the truth. In terms of the evolution of the species, the apparent opposing testimonies state the following. The biblical testimony. And God said, let the earth bring forth grass and the herb of the seed, the fruit trees yielding fruit after its kind, whose seed is in itself, upon the earth. And it was so. And the earth brought forth grass, the herb yielding seed after its kind, and the tree yielding fruit, whose seed was in itself after his kind. And God saw that it was good. John Ray, which we read previously, says basically the same thing. The National Academy of Sciences says evolution consists of changes in the heritable traits of a population of organisms. So that's the actual testimonies when they speak for themselves. So it's the actual testimony of the Word of God, contained in the biblical testimony, the testimony of the first scientists to define a kind of animal as a species, and the current prestigious National Academy of Sciences. After thousands of years of observing the Word of God and nature, we discovered that these testimonies do not oppose one another and are in fact in agreement with each other. The only opposition is found when others attempt to add or take away from these testimonies to justify their own beliefs and create false strawmen to do this. The same is true in modern religion that profess to be based upon the biblical testimony. Most promote doctrines that add, take away, and often oppose the biblical testimony to justify their own beliefs through similar sophist tactics. Therefore, we must allow the biblical testimony to speak for itself, sola scripta, in any test of doctrinal truth, to the law and to the testimony. If they speak not according to this word, it is because there is no light in them. Isaiah 8:20. Rule number 2, pan for the gold, and the rest will wash away with the dirt. A half-truth is far more difficult to detect, discern, and overcome than a lie. Half-truths are the foundation of sophism, beginning with Satan in the garden. So what did the Lord God say? And the Lord God commanded him, you may eat freely from every tree of the garden. but you must not eat from the seed or from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. For in the day that you eat of it, you will surely die. And the actual literal translation is you will surely begin to die. The serpent, what did he say to Eve? Now the serpent was more cunning than any beast of the field that the Lord God made. And he said to the woman, did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden? In terms of the word of God versus the testimony of the theory of evolution, we have already observed that when they're each allowed to speak for themselves, the actual defined theory, inheritable changes to populations over succeeding generations, is not in opposition to the biblical testimony. But this is only the half-truth that is necessary to establish the only observable truth of the theory. After over 150 years since Darwin and all of the advances in science and unearthing billions of fossils, no more observable evidence has been found than what the Bible testified to in the second chapter of the very first book of the first prophet over 3,500 years ago. It took man 1,500 years to scale the mountain, only to find Moses waiting at the top for doubters to catch up. Starting with Darwin, the theorists began by giving this observation of the variations that exist in the gene pools of living organisms that are expressed in succeeding generations the name evolution. Darwin next observed that the environment these variant succeeding generations lived in played a key role in determining which traits among them was best suited to survive in. Long-haired variants survive best in cold weather. Shorter-haired variants survive best in hot weather. Those best suited for their environment were observed to be the dominant population. Darwin named the observance of this mechanism natural selection. He was correct and is credited for being the first to formally do so. Having named his observation as evolution through the process of natural selection, his observation did not oppose these biblical testimony or that of prior observations in nature. But he also used two other terms that he proposed to demonstrate in his theory. One is the origin of the species, the title of his book. This is where the observable truth ends and the sophism begins. We previously discussed the strawman tactic for using the term species to define the variations of what had been termed the kind. But he also best to demonstrate through his theory the origin of the species and how they all evolved from a common original ancestor. It was called the origin of the species. This unobservable belief was lumped together with strawman species terms in a masterful demonstration of sophism, whereby he created an appearance of the truth without offering any evidence of it. He even twisted the obvious evidence against his theory, the lack of transitional fossils, to be an evidence for his theory, and that only lacked further observation. Kidnapping and silencing the fossil record opposition for the past 150 years. He named it specifically and said, time will change that. It just hasn't been observed long enough. So he kidnapped that whole testimony against him and said, just wait, just watch, just observe more. You'll see these transitional fossils. The unproven and unobservable beliefs are the type of things that get lumped together with the half-truth to become what appears to his audience to be the observable theory of evolution. There are many ways to test for gold, including subjecting it to a laboratory assay test or to 2,000 degrees of heat, where all the impurities are separated from the remaining gold. However, few of us have access to a lab or 2,000 degree kiln. However, there are ways that are just as effective that most all of us can do by ourselves. Pan for the gold. We scoop up a pan of earth from the bottom of flowing water. We get a mixture of elements. As we swirl them all together, the lighter and worthless dirt and pyrite or fool's gold and other elements all wash away, and only the weightier gold remains left in the pan. The above picture is of 40 ounces of gold with a current market value of $120,000 taken from a mountain creek. Penning for gold is not only possible, but if gold is present, it can be very profitable. In the same manner, this is the best way to sift through all the worthless elements, the sophistic rhetoric that is lumped together with the genuine gold so that only the gold, or the truth, remains in our pan, or our knowledge of the truth. In terms of the modern theory of evolution, the worthless elements are those lumped together with the half-truth that go beyond observable truth. This includes the origin of the universe and all life on Earth, the age of the Earth, the testimony of the geological record and the fossils it contains, and all other elements that go beyond the defined theory in observing inheritable changes in successive generations over time. Modern theorists have broken from the original objective of the traditional ancient philosophers like Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, of a genuine search for the truth, wherever the evidence may lead them, to voluntarily follow the method of the sophists and exclude themselves from observing any evidence of the possibility of a supernatural God. They have predetermined only natural suppositions exist. Therefore, when panning for gold and comparing the testimonies that directly oppose the biblical testimony, we are left with the ability to test the evidence observed in the natural world. We've already done so with the term species versus what is observed in the natural world, with what the theories claim and how they cunningly employ their strawman claims, even to the point of contradicting their own definitions, like the ability to interbreed, to make it appear they knocked down the strawman testimony of the Bible and then that they had raised up. Fortunately, we can test the claims of the theorists for their truth by comparing them to the actual evidence observed in each of their claims. Let us now begin to pan for genuine gold and allow the fool's gold to wash away with the dirt. For each element, I will give an example of what the modern sophists claim, and then briefly describe the actual evidence pertaining to those claims that has been observed in nature. I'm not seeking to pick on any targeted or any target or so on any easy target incapable of defending themselves. Instead, I will provide quotes only from the leading influencers who have profited most in their reputations and earnings. So the science guy, Bill Nye, I won't tell you what I call him, but the main idea in all of biology is evolution. To not teach it to our young people is wrong. So you're saying the primary, all of biology is evolution. And to not teach that to our students is wrong. That's pretty easy if you go by the definition, just inheritable traits. But sorry, let me just go back here. So origins, the law of biogenesis versus the hypothesis of abiogenesis. The fundamental law of biology, he said it's evolution, but the fundamental law of biology is biogenesis. Only life begets life. The biological hypothesis of abiogenesis that opposes the foundational law to claim life spontaneously originated from non-living organic materials or natural origins. The boast of the original sophists was their ability to make the weaker argument appear to be the stronger through their false rhetorical devices. Creating a false appearance of truth enabled them to persuade the audience into adopting sophist beliefs to achieve their objectives. Young people are taught abiogenesis in school when natural origins is lumped together and taught alongside the theory. In this, the sophist mission is achieved. So you can imagine that the strongest law, the most observable law, not even a theory or the law, is not taught when teaching evolution. What is taught is a natural, spontaneous generation of life for an unobservable hypothesis. And that's what, Bill Nye says young people should be taught. We are left to observe and determine to ourselves which testimony from science demonstrates the greatest evidence of its truth, the observable law of biogenesis or the unobserved hypothesis of abiogenesis, because both opposing testimonies cannot be true. Either one or neither is truth. So how can you be a scientist and have a law and then go with a hypothesis that's against the law and then teach that? So the biblical testimony on origins. So this one includes the animals. The first chapter of the first biblical book testifies of origins. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And God said, let the waters under the heaven be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. And God said, let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after his kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth. And it was so. And the earth brought forth grass, and herb yielding seed after its kind, and the tree yielding fruit, whose seed was in itself after his kind. And God saw that it was good. And God said, let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creature that hath life, and fowl that may fly above the earth in the open firmament of heaven. So he's talking about creatures of the sea and of the air. And God created great whales and every living creature that moves, which the waters brought forth abundantly after their kind, and every winged fowl after his kind. And God saw that was good. So the same thing, they each have their own seed. And God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and um, let fowl, so these orioles, multiply in the earth. And God said, um, that the earth bring forth the living creature after. So now I'm talking about the earth, the land animals. That the earth bring forth the living creature after his kind, cattle and creeping things and beasts of the earth after his kind. And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth after his kind, and cattle after their kind, and everything that creeps upon the earth after his kind. And God saw that it was good. So everything, the land, the sea, and the air has its own seed. And then there's man, who doesn't classify him as any of these beasts. And God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the earth, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So you see the distinction between man and the beasts and the animals, the fish. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created him. Male and female created he them. Uh, so what does Richard Dawkins say about the statistical probability of the origins that he just describes? The essence of life is statistical improbability on a colossal scale. I'm going to show you what he's actually talking about here. Oops, sorry. In probability theory, the probability of an event is a numeric measure ranging from 0 to 1, where 0 denotes impossibility and 1 denotes certainty. When the probability of an event is 0, it means the event is impossible and will not occur under any circumstances. This situation arises when there are no favorable outcomes for the event among all possible outcomes. In practical terms, a probability of 0 indicates a complete lack of likelihood or occurrence for the specified event. It is an essential concept in probability theory used to quantify uncertainty and analyze various scenarios in mathematical and statistics, and absolutely foundational to the scientific method. The following are a few quotes from various professors of science. Statistics has been the most successful information science. Those who ignore statistics are condemned to reinvent it. If this probability calculus be condemned, then the whole of sciences must also be condemned. Aristotle said, the probable is what usually happens. It's pretty simple. Probability is expectation founded upon partial knowledge, a perfect acquaintance with all of the circumstances affecting the occurrence of an event would change expectations into certainty and leave neither room for demand for a theory of probabilities. So when you have certainty, you don't need some sort of theory of probabilities. If a truth, um, it is a truth very certain that when it is not in our power to determine what is true, we ought to follow what is most probable. When you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. Albert Einstein said, I will never believe that God plays dice with the universe. It's not based on chance. The quote from Dawkins was in response to the fact that observed science has determined that the natural origin of even a single-celled living organism arising from non-living organic matters involves an entire series of zero probability events to occur. Not just one, and remember, zero probability means impossible, but a whole series of zero probability events has to occur in order for life to arise from non-living uh, organic material. By definition, this means that a series of events such as series of events, each with having zero probability of occurring, must occur for life to emerge naturally from non-living elements. Dawkins wrote an entire book titled Climbing Mount Improbable, in an attempt to demonstrate how the mountain of evidence of zero probability of natural origins might have, could have, may have occurred despite the evidence that defies us. So when he talks about the statistical improbability being on massive scale, and that's the essence of life, he's just trying to justify the fact that the actual evidence, scientific evidence of probability, is completely impossible for that origin of life to be natural. Dawkins did not offer any observable evidence in his climb up the mountain, only a series of rhetorical arguments and sophist devices attempting to create the appearance of the weaker argument being superior to the stronger, and purpose to persuade the audience to adopt his beliefs. We are able to observe through the observed testimony of science whether to believe the evidence of the zero probability of the natural origins of life on Earth, or the unobserved theories, unobserved rhetoric of Dawkins. The weightier nuggets should remain in the pan, while the fool's gold washes away with the dirt. The geological record and the preserved fossils. Remember, Darwin put this forth as something that testifies against his theory, or uniformitization with catastrophism. According to the National Geographic Society, Charles Darwin, the founder of evolutionary biology, looked at uniformitarianism as support for his theory of how new species emerge. The evolution of life, he realized, required vast amounts of time because it's so impossible. So you have to give it more time, more time. And the science of geology now showed Earth was extremely old. So this is what they stated about Darwin, and that was 150 years ago before all the science emerged. According to Wikipedia, in geology, uniformitarianism has included the gradualistic concept that the present is the key to the past, and that geological events occur at the same rate now as they have always done through although many modern geologists no longer hold to a strict gradualism, and I'll talk about that later. Coined by William Whewell, uniformitization, I'm not going to give up that word, was originally proposed in contrast to catastrophism by British naturalists in the late 18th century, starting with the work of geologist James Hutton and his many books, including The Theory of Earth. Hutton's work was later refined by scientist John Player and popularized by geologist Charles Lyell. So he's an associate and friend of Darwin. So after this, which was the early 19th century, late 18th century, actually after 1830, little attention was paid to flood geology over the rest of the 19th century. The visions of Ellen White, published in 1864, so again, just 5 years after Darwin, informed the Seventh-day Adventist Church views and influenced 20th century creationism. The Seventh-day Adventist Church, led by Ellen G. White, took a six-day creation literally and believed that she received divine messages supplementing and supporting the Bible. Her visions of the flood and its aftermath, published in 1864, described a catastrophic deluge which reshaped the entire surface of the earth. The writings of White were the basis of a book by Adventist school teacher George McCready Price, and eventually by scientists Whitcomb and Morris's book, The Genesis Flood, which was published in 1961. This began the formal science-based rebuttal of the theory referred to today as creation science. Today, there are numerous credible creation science resources or resource websites that are often subject to the scorn and ridicule of modern theorists. An example among them is answersingenesis.org, and in particular, relevant to this subject of uniformitizationism versus catastrophism, is the featured work by geologist Dr. Steve Austin, a leading expert on the catastrophic eruption of Mount St. Helens. The Mount St. Helens major eruption of May 18, 1980, remains the deadliest and most economically destructive volcanic event in U.S. history. 57 people were killed, 200 homes, 47 bridges, 18 miles of railway, and 185 miles of highway were destroyed. A massive debris avalanche triggered by a magnitude 5.1 earthquake caused a lateral eruption that reduced the elevation of the mountain's summit from 9,677 feet to 8,363 feet, leaving a 1 mile wide horseshoe-shaped crater. The eruptions of Mount St. Helens triggered multiple Earth-shaping forces. The original blast of steam was followed by landslides, volcanic ash flowing on the ground, mud flows, steam water waves on Spirit Lake, and falling volcanic ash. Together, these produced complex sediment layers up to 600 feet. Resulting deposits contain sequences of multiple layers, including many fine volcanic ash beds, ranging in thickness from a tiny fraction of an inch to some as thick as 3 feet. Each bed was laid in just a few seconds to several minutes, resulting in a 1/40th scale mini Grand Canyon. So that whole thing that happened in a short time created like a 1/40th scale Grand Canyon. During the initial blast, more than 2/3 of a cubic mile of rock material slid down the side of the volcano, blocking the drainage from Spirit Lake into the Toutle River. It was the largest debris avalanche observed in human history. Nearly 2 years later, on March 19th, 1982, hot volcanic ash from another explosive eruption of Mount St. Helens melted a thick snowpack in the crater, creating a destructive sheet-like flood of water and mud, which became a mud flow. Reaching the earlier deposits blocking Spirit Lake, the flow cut channels through the debris at a speed of 40 miles per hour. Individual canyons appeared in a single day. On either side of the canyon were elevated plateaus resembling the north and south rims of the Grand Canyon. 17 successive flows formed a sixth dome in the sixth year between October 18, 1980 and October 26, 1986. These flows erupted more than 2.6 billion cubic feet of lava to form the sixth dome, which towered 1,150 feet above the crater floor. In June 1992, a large sample was collected from the surface of one of the last lava flows. Samples were sent to radioscopic laboratory in 1996 to be dated using the potassium argon method. So it's supposed to be the most thorough method used to test the age of the Earth. This method measures the amount of argon produced from the radioactive decay of potassium in the lava rock, presumably after it had erupted and cooled. The rock that they sent was a mere 10 years old, but the potassium argon clock dated the rock at 350,000 years old, and the minerals within the rock dated at up to 2.4 million years old. For a rock that was 10 years old, that we see as the first rock that they actually knew the date when it formed. In looking through the Grand Canyon, they don't know the date, so they send it to these labs and say, what date was this formed? Well, they knew in advance what date it was. They just submitted it for testing, and they found out that the rock itself was 350,000 years old, but kind of a contradiction was the minerals inside the rock dated up to 2.4 million years old. So the clock was a little off. Um, I think it might have been a repetition here. Okay, geological time. The volcanic blast of May 18, 1980, traveling at an initial speed of over 650 miles per hour, destroyed the forests in the surrounding 150 square miles within 6 minutes. Douglas firs as tall as 200 feet were instantly stripped of their branches and snapped like toothpicks. Within 5 years, an enormous log mat floating on Spirit Lake lost its bark and branches, rubbed off by the abrasive action of wind and waves. Scuba investigators of the lake bottom subsequently revealed that sheets of bark intermingled with volcanic sediments had formed a layer of peat more than 3 feet thick. Previously, geologists claimed that coal beds formed by the slow assumption of or accumulation of organic materials in vast swamps. They estimated about 1,000 years is required to form each inch of coal. So polystrate trees and coal seams. The website irc.org is another credible creation science resource that is equally ridiculed by modern theorists. Dr. John Morris, who's now deceased, was the son of Henry Morris, who co-authored the first creation book titled The Genesis Flood. Dr. John Morris had a BS in civil engineering from Virginia Tech, an MS from the University of Oklahoma, and a PhD in geological engineering from the University of Oklahoma. In 1984, he joined his father's Institute for Creation Research, and in 1996, he became its president. Dr. Morris authored an ICR article titled The Polystrate Trees and Coal Seams of Jogging's Fossil Cliffs. So polystrate means multiple strata. So these trees that penetrate multiple strata of coal seams in a place called Joggings. And this is significant, you'll see in a second. This article is particularly relevant because it relates to a modern observation of the exact coal beds located at Joggings on the east coast of Canada that Sir Charles Lyell, so the person that was a friend and colleague of Charles Darwin, and the principal architect of the principle of geological uniformity, used to help prove his theory of uniformitarianism. Lyell claimed that upright fossil trees rose from several successive layers of coal. It could barely be imagined, he argued, that tree trunks could maintain their upright position during transportation in a watery catastrophe. Thus, Joggings became a major argument against the evidence of the flood and catastrophism. As a result, the influence of the biblical flood waned, proving the way They're paving the way for Darwin usage of biological uniformitarianism. So in other words, the very spot he went to, these coal beds, he saw these upright, what he described as upright forests, and saying, how could they be transported to this location and still be upright? So this isn't a catastrophic event. It all located here. These forests grew out of this, et cetera, et cetera. What Morse observed in the coal beds of Joggins in 1989, so this is when Dr. Morse went back in 1989, less than a decade after the Mount St. Helens eruption, was exactly what Dr. Steve Austin observed as having occurred and developed as a result of the original volcanic eruption and the resulting earth-shaping events that followed it. So he went back to the original place where Lyell was, and he observed exactly what Austin had observed at Mount St. Helens. These observations were at the coal bed. Lyell proved uniformitarianism 2 centuries earlier. Dr. Harold Coppin listed several reasons summarized below to consider that the trees have been moved to this location, washed in during a catastrophic and extensive and massive sedimentation. A distinctive soil level is missing. Only a few of the trees arise from the original coal layers. Often the trees rest on top of a coal seam, but roots seldom penetrate into it, as they would if a tree grew in a peat bog. These stumps arising from non-organic layers have no possible soil present. The vertical stumps often penetrate 2 or 3 more strata, including thin seams of coal. Often they overlap over trees arising out of overlaying layers. A dead, hollow, and submerged stump could not persist for the long period of time necessitated for a second forest to grow and collect as peat. Segments of roots are often found inside the once hollow trunks, while other fossil roots are normally detached and buried in the surrounding soil. This seems to be a very unlikely scenario for any growth in situ hypothesis. Leaves, which seldom remain on a forest swamp floor for long periods without decay, yet well-preserved fossil leaves are abundant, thus indicating rapid burial. Some of the fossilized trees are inclined, not directly in vertical growth positions. A few are found upside down. None of the tree root systems are complete. All have been truncated. The marine tubeworm, and he names the species, frequently found in fossilized association with the fossil trees, implies that all were exposed to seawater. So they found these worms that live in marine life in these same coal beds and the same trees. The surrounding sandstones are cross-bedded, implying rapidly moving water. The hollow vertical trees are typically filled with different sediments than the surrounding matrix. The internal sediments are themselves cross-bedded. The long axis of both the partial roots and the rootlets have a preferred orientation, as would result from movement, not through growth. The direction parallels current direction. So in other words, the same direction as the current is flowing, as determined from ripple marks and cross-bedding. In summary, the certainty of geological records exists. It is the actual artifact that is observable and contains the record of the evidence of its earth-shaping formation. The same record has been interpreted by theorists to be the evidence of uniformitarianism, to offer the billions of years they hope to allow the impossible to become possible, give it enough time. However, modern theorists have had to modify uniformitarianism to become long periods of uniformity interrupted by occasional periods of localized catastrophes like regional floods, etc. Because of the evidence, they've had to say it's not all, this earth wasn't shaped all by uniform events over time. That catastrophes have played a role in shaping it, but they try and limit these to a bunch of regional floods and local catastrophes, not a worldwide. Creationists interpret the same record and interpret the same evidence as having the stronger argument favoring, scientists interpret the same record and interpret the evidence as favoring the stronger argument favoring catastrophism, i.e., the observation that massive debarked trees penetrate hundreds of layers of coal that theorists claim required 1,000 years to form each inch of layered coal bed. So actual scientific observation is different than what the theorists claim. Fossil record formation, and we're almost through, so be patient with me. Fossils are found in sedimentary rocks. Majority of fossils are discovered in limestone, which itself is formed in shallow or under 50-foot depth, calcite-rich marine environments. The same conditions the Bible describes after the flood waters had completely immersed the entire earth. To get some idea of the volume of this marine-formed rock that is found all around the globe on dry land, limestone is the catalyst for making concrete and cement. Just think of how much concrete exists around the world today in our sidewalks, buildings, parking garages, and other structures. And there's no shortage of cement or the limestone catalysts today. So there's no one ever complaining there's not enough limestone left to keep making concrete. Limestone located fossils are formed in a rapid burial in a calcite or crushed marine shell, rich, muddy environment. Over 95% of the billions of fossils unearthed over the past 2 centuries are hard-shelled, bottom-dwelling marine life. These bottom-dwelling marine creatures are so abundant that they are the index fossils for every layer of the geological record. This means that fossilized birds, buffaloes, and dinosaurs are found together in fossil graveyards, together with these bottom-dwelling marine clams, mollusks, and other hard-shelled creatures. They are located from the tops of the mountain to the bottom of the deepest canyons. So how did all of this marine-formed limestone and the fossils contained within end up being found so abundantly all over the world? Was it a bunch of local, regional, freshwater events? Or does this marine-based rock and marine-based fossilization process that's dumped all of this rock and all these fossils on the Earth, could that be more from a global flood? The fossil record, fully formed life forms, and lack of transitional fossils. The two items that Darwin stated would be fatal to his theory were the lack of transitional fossils and any evidence that large groups of fully formed life were discovered in the absence of transitional fossils, both of which are exactly what has been observed the past 2 centuries. So I'm just going to just quote this exact article word by word, which is found in the essays on origins, creation versus evolution. Most evolutionists insist that the occurrence of evolution is an indisputable fact, even if its exact mechanism must remain speculative. Since evolution is believed to occur far too slowly to be discernible in the time frame of human observation, we must examine prehistoric evidence in the fossil record if we are to observe the fact of evolution. In his book, Historical Geology, evolutionist C.O. Dunbar said, fossils provide the only historic documentary evidence that life has evolved from simpler to more and more complex forms. But what does the fossil evidence say, and does it really support the evolutionary view of origins? Or is it perhaps more consistent with creation? Fossilization typically occurs when organisms, either living or dead, are deposited from water into sediment. In some instances, the sediment solidifies, making a cast of the entombed organism. In others, the organic material of the organism fossil is replaced by mineral to form a stony replica. Conditions must be perfect for the fossilization to occur, which perhaps explains why there is so little evidence of fossils being formed today. Both the burial of the organism and the hardening of the sediment must occur very rapidly, or the inevitable decay process will destroy the organism before it can become fossilized. Creationism believes that the fossil record reveals organisms that were mostly contemporary, not an evolutionary sequence extending over millions of years. Evolutionists believe that fossilization organisms were gradually deposited in layers of sediment over hundreds of millions of years, giving us a visual record of at least some of the stages of evolution from the first simple organism to the most complex. Most creationists, on the other hand, believe that nearly all fossils were formed over a relatively short period of time during and after a worldwide flood. Thus, creationists believe the fossil record reveals organisms that were mostly contemporary, not an evolutionary sequence extending over millions of years. Since these beliefs are sufficiently different, it should be quite easy to determine which is more consistent with the fossil record as it actually exists today. To be consistent with evolution, the fossil record should show how organisms slowly transform from one into another through countless intermediate or transitional stages, which is what Darwin said that we would find. Evolutionists, for example, claim that over 100 million years were required for the gradual transformation of invertebrates into vertebrates. We would expect that the fossil record should show at least some of the progressive stages of this large-scale transformation. To be consistent with creation, the fossil record should show no obvious transitional stages between distinctly different kinds of organisms, but rather each kind of organism should appear all at once and fully formed. It is now a generally recognized fact that the fossil record shows few, if any, unambiguous intermediary stages in the evolution of an organism into a distinctly different kind of organism. David B. Kitts, an evolutionist and paleontologist, said, despite the bright promise that paleontology provides a means of seeing evolution, it has presented some nasty difficulties for evolutionists, the most notorious of which is the presence of gaps in the fossil record. Evolution requires intermediate forms being species or forms between species, and paleontology does not provide them. The growth in our knowledge of the fossil record since Darwin's time provides even less support for evolutionary transformation. Evolutionists have been aware of these missing intermediate or transitional forms since the time of Darwin and have tried to dismiss the whole problem by appealing to the incompleteness of the fossil record. Evolutionists cling to the hope that the missing links, which they believe formed a continuous chain of evolution, may yet be found. But this seems unlikely since most paleontologists believe that the majority of all existing fossilized species of plants and animals have already been found and identified. Even more currently living kinds of plants and animals have been found in essentially their present form in the fossil record. David Rope, a paleontologist at the Field Museum of Natural History, reported that the growth in our knowledge of the fossil record since Darwin time provides even less support for evolutionary transformation. He writes, we are now about 120 years after the Darwin, and the knowledge of the fossil record has been greatly expanded. We now have 250,000 fossil species that the situation hasn't changed much. Ironically, we have even fewer examples of evolutionary transition than we had in Darwin's time. By this, I mean that some of the classic causes or cases of Darwinian change in the fossil record, such as the evolution of the horse in North America, have had to be discarded or modified as a result of more detailed information. So remember I showed you all those horses and their sizes? Well, from Darwin's time forward, they tried to line up the smallest to the biggest and show them as proof of evolution of the horse. And then, of course, when they started getting into biology, et cetera, they had to eliminate the horse from being, the evolution of the horse being shown in the fossil record. Some of the evolutionists have argued that the absence of transitional forms is simply an artifact of classification. Others insist that gaps occur only among the higher taxonomic groups, while still others insist the gaps occur only among the lower groups. The evolutionist George Gaylord Simpson conceded, however, that the gaps are a universal phenomenon. Every paleontologist knows that most new species, genera, and families, and that nearly all categories above the level of families appear in the record suddenly and are not led up to by known gradual, completely continuous transitional sequences. So he's in all series. Speaking of the highest level of animal classification, evolutionist Phil Handler claimed that some 25 major phyla are recognized for all the animals, and in virtually not a single case is there found evidence to demonstrate what the common ancestry of any two phylas look like. As for the lowest level of classification, the popular evolutionist Stephen Jay Gould said, in any local area, a species does not arise gradually, but by the steady transformation of its ancestors, it appears all at once and fully formed. This, of course, is exactly what creationists would expect to find, while most evolutionists still insist that there is at least a few examples of transitional forms in the fossil records. A growing number question whether the fossil record provides any real evidence of the transition from one organism into another. Evolutionist Stephen Stanley conceded that the known fossil record fails to document a single example of phyletic evolution accomplishing a major morphological transition. Stephen Jay Gould tells us that the extreme rarity of transitional forms is the fossil in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. It would go a long way, he says, toward correcting the evolutionary bias in our public schools if even this one trade secret were revealed to the students. So let them know, let them in on the secret. There's no evidence of this in the fossil record, but that doesn't mean we still believe in it. Here's our reasons for believing. And there's nothing wrong with debating things with real truth and letting people come to their own conclusion. It's when you falsify, when you use sophist arguments to deceive others, that's what's wrong. Despite the missing links in the fossil records, few evolutionists have abandoned their faith in the so-called fact of evolution. Despite the missing links in the fossil records, few evolutionists have abandoned their faith. Well, I believe it's reading twice. In an article defiantly titled "Who Doubts Evolution?" Oxford zoologist Mark Ridley declared, if the creationist wants to impress the Darwinian establishment, it will be no use prating on about what the fossils say. No good Darwinian's belief in evolution stands on the fossil evidence of gradual evolution. So nor will his belief fall by it. In other words, yeah, we can't stand on it. We're not going to fall on it because we don't care what it says. We're still going to believe, continue with our beliefs in spite of the evidence. In conclusion, all that glitters is not gold. And any genuine search for truth among apparent opposing testimonies, the first rule to apply to ensure that we are not being deceived by sophist rhetoric is to allow each opposing testimony to speak for itself. No matter our current belief or biases, despite our opinion of the improbability of the testimony that opposes our current beliefs, the surest way to avoid strongman devices is to first allow each testimony to define their own position. After this, anything that is lumped together with the original definition or defined position of either side is easily identified as the fool's gold. If not, it would be included in the defined position, not outside of it. We can then pan for the gold and test for the evidence of truth of all that is lumped together. If we ignore the rhetoric and focus solely upon the original artifact that pertains to the claim, we will discover the evidence of the truth. We will observe that either no evidence supports the lumped in claims, or that the proponents of any available evidence will demonstrate that the lumped in claims are the weaker argument, and the claims it attempts to oppose are the stronger argument. In terms of specific opposition to the Word of God, as written in the Christian Judean biblical testimony, zero actual evidence will be discovered for any testimony, religious or secular, that directly opposes the Word of God. At best, the opposing testimony will be revealed to be a blend of half-truths lumped together with untruths, employing sophist devices proposed to deceive the audience. As it was in the beginning, as it will remain till the end. While modern theists have restricted themselves from observing any evidence of a supernatural God, you and I have no such self-imposed restriction. If the knowledge of the truth is the pure gold we seek, then we must pan for the truth and allow everything else to wash away with the dirt until only the gold remains. Because we have, as we have discussed, and I have sought to demonstrate, all that glitters is not gold. On a final note, Professor Richard Dawkins co-founded an organization he called the Brights. So imagine you have the sophists, which are the wise ones, the Brights, you have philosophy being the wisdom and lovers of wisdom. So he actually co-founded an organization he called the Brights, this Professor Dawkins. He has many negative things to state against the biblical God and those that believe in him. The Bible spoke of Dawkins and all other modern sophists 2,000 years ago in Romans chapter 1. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of man who hold the truth in unrighteousness. In other words, those that deceive, that's what he means by that hold the truth in unrighteousness. Because that which may be known of God is manifest to them, so they can see it, they can test, they can see these things that that they don't believe it, and they believe something else, but when they test for it, it's made obvious to them that there's something. For example, the zero probability of natural origins. Well, the only thing that's different than natural origins is supernatural origins. For God hath showed it unto them. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made. So it can be understood by man, even the eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without cause. So even if they haven't read the Bible, that nature testifies to the exact same thing of the supernatural creation. Because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were they thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Now listen to this. Professing themselves to be wise. What is the Brights? What is the sophists? What is these professors? Professor Dawkins, professing themselves to be wise, they became fools and changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man, and to birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things, which is the modern theory of evolution, not the defined theory, but all that's lumped in with it. So finally, and I apologize for such a long thing, but finally we've come to the conclusion of chapter 13. So in that, I've stopped sharing. I have no idea what time it is. Oh, well, it's very late. Cut an hour over. Longest one I've ever done, but you can see why I had to make another chapter. So
That's okay. That was good. I enjoyed it didn't have measurements, but it was the same thing, proof. So much proving that the Bible's right and it's real. And like you said, the people that believe otherwise, a lot of them, I won't call people fools, but a lot of them with those beliefs are foolish.
I have never met an evolutionist that used to be a Christian that's not mad at God.
absolutely.
Anybody who goes from being to a Christian and they give up on God, they start believing in evolution. It's usually because they were either disappointed or some traumatic thing happened and they got mad at God.
Yeah, and see, that's
For
why
life
we
to
have
be
to
easier.
separate
If
out,
you
the
don't believe
Bible.
in God, life can be easy. You can do whatever you want. It's like, I'm a good person. Who cares?
That's
But
also
you
why
know,
we have
back
to,
back to Darwin and evolution, I have no way of knowing if this is true or not, but they claim that when Darwin died, he no longer believed in evolution.
yeah, it doesn't matter because his testimony is out there and it never changed.
Yeah,
So, but what I was saying is that's why we have to separate the biblical testimony from religion, because people can profess to observe the Bible, but say whatever they want as their position. And so a lot of what Melissa's talking about, where people end up being hurt. I mean, I myself was hurt at 5 years old by an experience in church, never went back, for 40 years. But the thing is, it's by a lot of the people, like I said, who become evolutionists or whatever, they don't believe the Bible because they were hurt by some non-biblical event, some non-biblical teachings, some non-biblical event, and they haven't learned to separate the biblical testimony from religion, or the biblical testimony from these theories that oppose it. So the important thing is, we established in chapter 12 and now in chapter 13 that the only way we can be certain we're not being deceived is have each testimony speak for itself. Don't let somebody else redefine it. Like even in religion, you can't let somebody else redefine what the Bible means. It has to speak for itself. And then anything that's different than what speaks for itself and it's lumped in together with it, that adds or takes away from it, is fool's gold. And the way you find out is you test that against the original artifact. So, and so why I've taken these great lengths is because, like I said, my original beliefs were that there was overwhelming evidence of evolution, because that's what I've been told, but I never tested it for myself. So I'm writing this book so that the final chapter, chapter 14, is purely with the numbers and the evidence and all of the actual prophetic evidence of the truth of the Word of God and of the soon return of Jesus Christ. So the first 10 chapters or 11 chapters kind of establish some of that evidence. And then chapter 12 and 13 talk about what opposes that evidence, so that people are prepared to actually look, hopefully, in an unbiased way at the last chapter and judge for themselves whether that's the evidence of the truth and whether that changes their own beliefs of, prior beliefs of the evidence of the truth. So anyway, like I said, I've taken up way too much of your own time, a lot, but it was really important that, and like I said, that's why I have 2 chapters and such long chapters, is because there's a lot of things that testify against the Bible, and I was able to handle most of it in 2 chapters, which I'm happy with.
Well, the first part of this one, almost the first hour, was almost a repeat of either 1 or 2 of 12.
2 of 12, yeah.
I don't know if we need to combine those or split
Yeah,
them a different.
yeah,
Chris was asking, and I'm like, well, we'll ask him, because some
yeah,
of it back at the same page number, same pictures of the animals, and it's like
yeah.
somewhere, and there is a 12, but I don't know. It's almost like part 1 was repeated today, and I don't know about part 2, so
Well,
maybe part 1. I don't
the
know.
chapter 12, part 1 and 2, the last part of part 2, was repeated because I had, that beginning information there, but I kind of tried to jam it in and I couldn't add, the rest of what it is. So chapter 13 really is, the last part of 12 and, the first part of 13. But remember, what we're talking about right now is all a work in progress. I'm just writing the book, and as I get through it, I edit and change. So,
Oh, it's good. It's good. It's just, he said that and I went back and looked and I was like, well, yeah, it is. But I know he said it was gonna, the first part was gonna be
yeah,
that way.
Well, the fact is that in Passover, we're going to be doing part, 1 to 7, or we'll do 7 presentations, but they'll be of the final edited, things. So we'll actually repeat all this, but from a very succinct, edited form of the book, so that in 7 presentations we can cover the whole book. So I'll cover, for example, chapter 1 and 2 in one presentation, and chapter 3 and 4 in one presentation, because it's all written and all edited and all final. So
Well, you won't be able to read 1 and 2 in one presentation, but you can skip through them.
that's right. And that's all you're trying to do in the presentation is, here's a
It's a
book that
long
you
book.
can get
It's
more
good.
details, but here's the highlights. And
Yeah.
most of what I'll be doing, I won't be actually reading from any of the book. I'll just be showing the points and talking about it. So it's more natural, more, okay, here's what we, here's, so you can read for yourself the details. It's just a little bit stiff when your whole presentation is reading, and you don't get a chance to take a break and explain what you mean for a second, and go back to it. And, like Keith did this morning when he's doing his presentation, he's reading, but he's also taking a time to give personal, when I saw the River Jordan, and that's what you need to be able to do, is more of that. Otherwise, it's like kind of wah, 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 So
And it's
anyway,
good.
I
It's a very exciting book, and I think it's going to do a lot of good to the people in the world. I really do. There
amen.
are some people that have no interest, but there's a lot of them that maybe think they don't, but they're fascinated with this stuff, and they'll be like, wow, all they have to do is see, a little bit of it, and they're going to jump right in and want to read it.
Well, like I said, I mean, part of the editing process, when you write the introduction of a book, I just have that introduction as a placeholder. But what you need to do is finish the whole book actually before you write the introduction, because then you can summarize everything that's in the book. So hopefully in the edited version, it'll get your attention right away, because it's going to talk about, here's the things that we're going to discover in this book.
Right.
So
Well, that's why if you go and watch and we showed it at Bible Explorations in the afternoon, the Exodus, the guy that went and he wanted to prove the Exodus, these people, Bible scholars he went and talked to, they didn't believe in the flood.
right.
And that's one of the things where they start having doubt. They start doubting one thing, and then that goes into starting doubting other things.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, God and Jesus actually delight in overcoming our doubts. They don't expect us just to believe everything. And I mean, you look at, it took a year of going line by line, scripture by scripture, to convince, some of the earliest, people that Christ was the foretold Messiah, but after they took the time to do it, they began calling them Christians, for, promoting, Christ as the Messiah. So, it's there's nothing wrong with doubt, and there's nothing wrong with looking at the evidence to find the truth. What's wrong is when people either don't look and they just accept everything without testing, or when that evidence has been purposely created to deceive people. And people, I think, would be kind of shocked, be in disbelief. You say, well, what do you mean modern theists like Richard Dawkins create purposed books and presentations to deceive people? Well, he believes it's true, but he knows there's no evidence of it. And so that is deception first of all, I didn't include in there in the book because, he calls God by all kinds of horrible names, just a whole of just calling God evil. But second of all, he calls people that believe in God basically stupid. He said, their brains have fallen out, basically. So if I use those same things and I'm just showing his quotes. If I said the same things about him in this book, then I'd be doing the same thing. I'd be attacking him and maybe against him as opposed to his evidence. So that's a sophist tactic too. It's an ad hominem attack, just attack the presenter, and then people won't believe him. But Darwin said some incredibly racist things, and he even ordered the species from lowest to highest in man, with the black being the lowest and closest to the primates, the apes and monkeys. I mean, he actually did that, so those are things that you don't include because it just, if people want to, they can find out for themselves, but it just prejudices somebody. I want people to be able to actually look at the evidence and compare the evidence.
Yeah, well, you go and look at Darwin's book, The Origin of Species, and I went and looked it up. I have it here. The origin of species by means of natural selection, which you brought up, or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life.
Right. Favored
And
races, yeah.
when people look at that there, they say, well, my goodness, they don't use that full title because they would see him as a racist today.
Right. It's an abridged title, and you
Yeah.
never see that title except for if you're buying or trying to study the original, like you said, the original book. But you can, put lipstick on a pig and it's still a pig,
Still a pig.
It's a cute pig.
yeah. Anyway,
You put lipstick on it to make it more adorable.
yeah, but it's still a pig. I wouldn't want to
It's
kiss it.
still a pig.
Oh, poor little piggy.
Anyway, oh, I don't mind pigs. I just, but they can also they can also eat their owners if they get too big and too hungry. So I respect them. I know they're smart, and I try to avoid them if possible.